first thing I want to do is to declare a few variables, some public, some private. I'm going to start off with a boolean. I'm going to call it ragdoll switch. And what this is going to do is to toggle from ragdoll to mechanim. Now I'm going to create a vector3, and this is going to determine how much and in what direction do we want to kick the rigid body. And last but not least, we're going to reference a public variable, and this is going to be a rigid body type, and this is where exactly do we want to kick our character. This might come in useful if you are creating a fighting game, such as, for example, if you're going to kick a character's foot and you want that character to fall down specifically at that spot, you probably want to assign a public reference variable on where do you want to kick the character, or a private reference variable if you are doing some sort of search function. Now, to keep things tidy, I'm going to create a function which will switch from rigid bodies to mechanim, and I'm going to call this ragdoll. We don't want to give this function the same name as the class, so I'm going to call it ragdoll switcher toggle. And now I want to specify a parameter on what state do we want to trigger it on. So it's going to be ball bool. It's going to go from either true to false, and this is going to be specified by the state boolean. Now what we're going to do is we're going to search through all of the children of this component, and we're going to pull out all of the rigid bodies. And this is how we're going to do that. We're going to declare a variable, and it's going to be an array. And to specify an array, you want to create just two square brackets next to one another. This means we're going to have a bunch of rigid bodies, not just one rigid bodies, but a list of them. This is what we're going to call it, rigid bodies. And we're going to assign this to this function. So game object dot get components in children, all the way down, and now it wants a certain type. What components do you want to get? Well, if we're going to be assigning this as rigid bodies, we want a rigid body. Rigid body. Okay, close this function. And now we're going to iterate through every single one of these rigid bodies, and we're going to do something to it. In this case, we're going to be turning it on or off. So we're going to do this through a certain function called a for each. We're going to declare a rigid body variable. I'm just going to call it rigid body. And then we're going to reference this array up here, rigid bodies. Okay, and then it's pretty simple. What we're going to do is, if you remember the isKinematic command, which is going to be transferring things from either rigid bodies being affected by the outside physics or rigid bodies being able to move by a transform, if it's on, if isKinematic is on, that means we can move the rigid bodies by a transform. Now, we want to be agnostic to what exactly will be their state, so we're going to assign their state to our state variable here. Cool, let's move on. I want our hero to go to mechanim by default, not to the rigid body. So in the beginning of the script, I'm just going to call this function with a true parameter. Pretty simple. Ragdoll switcher toggle, and I'm going to specify to true. So set them to kinematic, which allow the character control to take control. And to have some control ourselves, instead of having a random launch of the character, I would actually want to launch it myself and do it on a key command. So that's exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm going to set up the update function, And then I'm going to go into the input class. So if input that get key down, so it's asking us, hey, if you press the key once, launch this command. And in the parameters, we're going to specify a key code that space, so spacebar, close both of these parameters, open this conditional up, and now we're going to be actually toggling this ragdoll switch boolean. So if it's true, it's going to be false, and vice versa. Pretty simple command. Ragdoll switch equals not ragdoll switch. So this operator up here just means not. So whatever this value is, it's going to give us the opposite of that value. If it's true, it's going to give us false, and vice versa. Now, we're going to be launching this command up here, this ragdoll switcher toggle, with this ragdoll switch boolean. Ragdoll switcher toggle and ragdoll switch. Now we're going to go into our animator component and our character controller and disable both of them. So like we did before, get component, animator, dot enabled, so disable this component or enable it, ragdoll switch. True or false. If it was false before, now it's true, and vice versa. Okay, second, get component, character controller, dot enabled equals ragdoll switch. And then the kick. Who can forget about the kick? This is the funnest part. Set up a conditional once again, and we're going to ask, hey, is ragdoll switch, if it's currently turned off, which means if the rigid bodies are on, then perform this action. And that's going to be a swift kick. So get component, movement manager, it's going to be movement manager C, dot enabled equals ragdoll switch. So we want to turn off our moving when our character is on his head or on his back or wherever position he might end up being. And then we're going to reference this rigid body, and now we're going to give it a command. Now if you remember back from movement manager B here, we were moving the character around with add relative force. So we were giving it force along its local axis. Now we don't want to do this with the character in this case, because the explosion or whatever, the push from the spaceship that's gonna launch our hero straight out of the airlock is only coming from one place. It doesn't matter in what direction the character is facing. So we're not going to use add relative force. Instead, we're just going to use add force. So world coordinates, global coordinates, not local. And that's it. We're going to pass on this kick variable here. That was a good amount of code. Let's go back to Unity to see if everything worked out. Sweet. We're not getting any errors, which oddly enough might not be a good thing, because just because we're not seeing errors in the console, we can still have bugs during runtime. Let's go ahead and drop this script onto our hero. Okay. And we want to assign a rigid body. This is up to you. You can pick out whichever rigid body you find most interesting. Perhaps the probably most common will be the root, which will launch the character from the center. And this is going to tell us how much force you want to apply. You want to be pretty generous with these numbers. I'm going to give this 5,000 to start off with. I might even go higher. Now we want him to be kicked here in the Z direction from the negative Z. So I'm going to assign this a negative number. This is how much he is going to be kicked towards these doors. And well, I'll just start off with 5,000 again. We might play around with these values, but for now, let's just see where it takes us. And so we can see this better in the game view, so we don't have to constantly reference in the scene view. I'm just going to move the camera up. There it is. Move this a little bit further. I'm going to position this onto the hero, and that's it. Let's just see if everything works. And everything does not work. See, what did I tell you? Runtime bugs. Let's go back to our script and find out what's going on. Okay, let's go through the script real quick. Problem is not in here, not in the reference variables. This script is pretty rudimentary, not to have problems. This start function just launches this function. That's not going to have any problems. I'm assuming the problem is run somewhere in this update function. So we're not pressing space, so the problem is not within this conditional. Moving on. Okay, let's check if this ragdoll boolean is currently off. Considering it starts off by default, it starts off as false. This is going to happen every single frame when it starts. And it's going to turn off our movement manager, thus turning off all the controls for the character controller. And the way that we're going to solve this is to simply nest this function. The solution is pretty simple, is to put this curly brace right next to this if conditional, thus nesting it. Considering this is going to be nested, we're going to indent this just for the sake of tidiness. Save, and I do not foresee any further issues. Okay. Okay, character is waving, pretty good. Turning. We don't have a character turning animation aside, just for the sake of this tutorial, for the sake of simplicity. But we are getting movement. Okay, character is moving, probably moving a little bit too fast. We can change that in a bit. And, oh, there he goes. Yeah, he's being kicked. That's pretty fun. And as soon as he is getting kicked, we're no longer allowed to do anything, but we can go back to the same place to see him being kicked again. We'll fix this a little bit with a camera in a bit. In the meantime, I'd love to see this again. I sure hope I'm not enabling any sadism in any of you. Okay, and there he goes. Pretty fun. Okay, so there's the character controller. It's gonna go back to the spot if I press space.